Trigger warning. This podcast is about grief. Whether you are newly bereaved or whether you have been stuck in grief for years, I do hope this podcast brings you some comfort. Grief is such a universal experience, but we all do it differently. This podcast is not about fixing you or forcing the healing process, because there is no cure for grief. It can only be absorbed, experienced, loved and cared for. So whether you are doing it privately behind closed doors, or like me, you are kicking and screaming your way through, let's support each other. This is a safe space where we can come together and share experiences. My hope is that this podcast shines a light on your path and gives you the strength to navigate your way through the grieving process. My name is Louise Bates, and I'm so pleased we connected. I'm looking forward to interviewing people who have also walked this path to find out what worked for them, in the hope that it helps you too. I'm sending you so much love and support, and I look forward to sharing this crazy journey with you. Hello and welcome to A Gift for Grief podcast. And today I am delighted to be speaking to someone very close to me. This person is like my own personal guru and also my social media and website expert. Although she does try to avoid helping me with my social media and website. So my guest today is my daughter, Piper.
Hello.
And no, I haven't run out of guests to interview. I really do believe Piper has a lot to offer the listeners regarding her experience of losing her younger brother, Matthew. So welcome to the podcast, Piper.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Now, for people who have read my books, they may be confused because in my books you're called Sarah. So perhaps we could start with why you decided to change your name.
I never really decided to change my name. It wasn't something that I ever thought I would do.
It was a good name.
It was a good name. And then I think it was in the pandemic. It was on the first year of the pandemic. I just didn't feel like Sarah anymore.
Yeah.
It's really stupid, but I was watching a short film called Piper, which is a really cute little animated movie. And for some reason it was in my head, I just sort of clicked like, oh, that feels like me. And I asked my partner to start calling me that for a little bit just to see if it felt okay. And it just sort of felt like the thing to do. I feel more comfortable using that name. I made a comic about it straight after changing it to express myself somehow, and I do it through drawing, I guess.
Why not? Yeah.
It was called A Rose by Any Other Name, which is referencing Shakespeare. I don't know if you know anything about Shakespeare, but A Rose by Any Other Name would
just trying to show my ignorance here now, aren't you?
A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. And it's basically like I'm the same person through and through. I just have a different label on me now.
Oh, I love that.
I kind of compared my name to like a new item of clothing. So whereas Sarah was a really old, loved jumper or t-shirt, now I'm wearing a new shirt that fits me a bit better and feels more comfortable with me, but I still have a love and appreciation for the old jumper. You know? So that's kind of how I feel about it. But like I said, not everybody is going to feel that.
Well, it's important you've got to feel comfortable with the person
exactly.
you are, and if that suits you better and you feel better with that, then that's fine. But as a parent, have to admit, it's hard because you've been Sarah for over 30 years and suddenly I've got to start calling you Piper, and I don't always get it right,
You've been pretty good. You've been pretty good
But
about
what
it,
I like about you is you laugh it off and you just say, well, as long as you try, that's all that matters.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with all these different things, is that as long as you're making an effort, that's what I care about. Like, if you were deliberately going around and calling me Sarah all the time, then I'd be a little bit like, oh, that. Yeah. It's kind of like, what? Like, clearly, this is my decision and you're not respecting it. But the fact that you try and like you're not perfect, but like you're making an effort, and that's
I'm near perfect, though, aren't I?
questionable. We'll say.
So, what do you think Matthew would have said about you changing your name?
I don't really know. I guess he probably would have just laughed at me because, like, oh God, what are they doing now? But yeah, I think he probably would have had the same response to you guys. You know, like just kind of going with it and seeing, like, you know, I think he would have recognised that this is something that's important to me, and
Yeah. Good.
And if he didn't, then I would have just started calling him some other name instead. Until
I'm sure you would have found something to row about. But no, seriously, growing up, you and Matthew were very close. And I remember if I needed to tell you off for anything, Matthew would say, "Oh, Mum, don't tell her off. She didn't mean it." And if I was telling Matthew off, you would stand up for him and say, "Oh, Mum, don't tell him off." And people often commented on how close you both were. Do you remember it being like that?
Yeah, I do. And it's weird because I have a lot of friends who obviously have siblings, and I've not met anybody else who have had the same experience that me and Matt did, where we just didn't row. We didn't, like, bicker. And I'm sure we did, like, maybe occasionally, like, maybe make a snide remark at each other once or twice, but I don't really remember that. I just remember we almost had this, like, unspoken bond that nobody else was allowed to, like, tell us off. Nobody was allowed to get mad at, like, our sibling, you know? Like, it was always, we just sort of looked out for each other.
It was like you protected each other, didn't you?
Yeah, but I don't really know where that came from. Because, like I said, I've met loads of different siblings who have never had that experience.
Yeah.
There's always some bickering. And people, whenever they hear, like, oh, you know, growing up, you know, you and Matt must have fought all the time. You must have argued all the time. It's like, no. I wasn't like that with my siblings growing up. We were always trying to get each other into trouble. So now Matthew was very sporty and you were very arty. And when you both left school, you went in different directions. Your friendship groups were very different and you didn't socialise with each other, but you always had that closeness. And then Matt went off to university and you moved out and your paths didn't really cross, did they? Is that how you remember it? I guess I could have described our relationship as, like, I knew how Matt was because I'd ask you. I'd go, like, oh, how's Matt doing? And then you'd tell me, and I imagine he was, like, the same with me. So yeah, we didn't really talk directly. We just, I think growing up, and that's one of the reasons, thinking about it, that we didn't sort of bicker, was that we didn't really have that much in common to bicker about. Like, it wasn't like I had some diverse opinions about football that he would have argued with me about or something. Like, I didn't have an opinion about football, and the same with art. Like, he didn't have an opinion about the things like the anime stuff that I was watching and the movies I was watching. They were just, he just didn't have opinions about those things. So but like he wrote me a letter near the end saying, like, we were like chalk and cheese, but we still had that love for each other, which I think was always really, really nice. Just that he sort of acknowledged that as well.
Oh, that's really lovely. I've not read that letter.
Yeah,
it's something between you and Matt,
personal,
and absolutely. So, Piper, could you share what it was like for you when you found out about Matthew's cancer diagnosis?
Yeah, so it's weird because I remember when you told me, I think I didn't really acknowledge how serious it was. Like, I didn't really, and I don't know if that was because there was an element of him trying to protect me, or you were trying to protect me from knowing how difficult it was. But when I first found out about it, like, I knew people who had had cancer, like, and were fine now. And in my head, I was like, well, that's just what happens with cancer now. Like, people get cancer and they're fine. Like, people recover from it. And I just kind of assumed that would happen, like, I just, it was like, well, yeah, obviously, like, it was a big deal because obviously it was like a scary thing, like, mortality was suddenly on the table, his mortality was on the table, but I was like, oh yeah, he'll be fine. And I think I just kind of went into, I have to make sure everybody else is okay. Everybody else is obviously really stressed about this. I feel okay because I fully expected him to sort of come out the other end and be fine. And so I'm just going to, like, make sure that everybody else is okay and protect everybody else. So yeah, I guess I tried to sort of just roll with it.
Yeah.
I remember, like, that night, because I was living at home at the time. I'd very recently broken up with a nasty boyfriend and come back home.
We won't go there.
We won't go there. And come back home, and I think it was like maybe 6 months after that. And yeah, it was weird. Like I said, I don't remember much of the after knowing. I remember finding out, and then there's a sort of block in my memory of what happened after that. I just remember thinking, he's going to be fine, and I have to make sure that everybody else is fine while we're going through this.
So how did your relationship with Matthew change as he became more ill?
It changed dramatically, because we went from kind of not really talking that much to suddenly we were seeing each other a lot more often. Like he was at home more because he was getting iller. And we talk about more deep stuff. And then sort of as his illness progressed and he got really ill and it started to become quite clear that he wasn't going to get better, we ended up having some really good conversations that I don't think that we would have had otherwise, which is a weird thing to think about because, you know, it's not like I'm grateful for his illness or anything like that, but I'm grateful that it gave me the opportunity to have those sorts of conversations with him, because I wouldn't have had those conversations otherwise.
No.
You know, he really sort of encouraged me with my comics that I was making. He was like, you know, you should go and do something with those, and you know, he encouraged me to do other stuff that like I went and did, and I'm really proud of myself for that. And it's also kind of bittersweet because it's like I would have liked to be like, hey, look what I did.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard because I wish we had that before he got sick.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that we did have that in the end, that we did have those nice conversations, and we did did get to sort of bond with him more closely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that was. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that.
But it's one of those things, isn't it? If he had died suddenly in an accident, you know, there's no easy way to lose somebody.
No, I thought absolutely.
But at least you can take some comfort that you had these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he wrote you a letter, and you have that to remember him by, and that can comfort you. I
feel really lucky in some ways that I had that at all, because, you know, I know so many people who have died suddenly, and they, like, you know, and it was completely out of the blue, and we didn't get to, like, the people who loved them didn't get to say, you know, all the things they needed to say to them.
Yeah.
And that's harder. And I mean, I think all of it's hard. You know, there's no like hardest possible grief award. But I think, you know, it's definitely, we definitely had a privilege to be able to say goodbye to him properly.
Yeah, yeah. So you wrote a very poignant letter to Matthew's cancer.
Yeah.
Which I included in my book Letters to Matthew. And I actually shared it on a cancer Facebook group that I'm in. And so many people remarked on it, saying how it helped them. And a lot of these people were cancer patients themselves. So you had a very interesting perspective about his cancer. Perhaps you'd like to tell the listeners about it.
Yeah, was this... Am I allowed to swear? Is it the one with a swear word in it?
Oh, I don't know. You're going to swear. Go on then.
Is it the one that's called Fuck Cancer?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I hear those words a lot around cancer. And there is a part of me that still feels very much like, you know, that sentiment towards cancer. Yeah. And at the same time, like, I feel like saying that or expressing that hatred towards cancer it's weird, because the way cancer works is that it's your own body cells mutating and changing and duplicating over and over and over again. And in that sort of world, it thinks it's doing the right thing. It thinks like it's like a little machine that's like a little robot that's like, I'm producing these cells and this is what I'm supposed to do, this is what I'm programmed to do. And the programming's wrong. Sorry, I'm a programmer, so this is, I'm just
No, it's making sense. I like the analogy.
You know, so the programming is like, oh, I'm going to go along and do these things. I'm going to go do this, be this good little robot, not really maybe realising that what it's doing is really damaging to, like, the body that it's living in. And so those cells were Matthew's cells, you know, they're Matt's cells that were growing. And so it felt really weird to me to say that to his cancer, because, like, well, that's a part of him. Like, it's doing something really horrible and it's killing him, but it doesn't know that. And so, yeah, I think I felt really conflicted towards it, because obviously, like, it doesn't have a life or anything. It's not sentient, but when Matt died, so did the cancer cells that were killing him. And so it's really hard for me to feel any kind of hatred or anger towards that, because it's just part of who he was.
Yeah.
It's part of his body. Does that make sense?
It does, and it does. And I like the way that you look at it, because a lot of people look at it as an alien. It's something that's come from outside and it's attacking them. But it's something that's their body has created, that internal environment, for whatever reason, has created a tumour.
Yeah.
And doesn't matter how much hate you send it, you know. I mean, I felt that throughout the process, I was sending it love, because I felt like, oh, I was throwing everything at it, as you knew. And I thought, well, let's just throw some love in there as well. And sometimes, you know, it might help, who knows? But hate is such a strong...
I don't think that there's any world that hate is going to do any good for anywhere, anything. And that's true, I think, of every situation. I think that the only thing that could ever do good is love. And that's a really complicated thing to say for lots of different reasons. But I really, I figured that because I felt similarly to you, like, I didn't want to hate the cancer while he was poorly and getting sicker. I wanted to, like, do anything that I could possibly can, and if that meant loving the cancer, you know, I was going to do it, because, like, maybe that'll help, you know. So and also I think hating it would have made me feel worse, and, like, I didn't want to. We're all obviously in a very difficult mental health position anyway, because it's a horrible thing to have to go through. And so to then also feel hatred towards something, I think that would have really just killed me off.
Yeah.
Like, it was it was too much sadness and too much pain.
No, I just think that letter was beautiful, and I remember reading it and it made me cry. Just talking about it now, I can feel the emotion coming up as well. But, you know, I'm so proud that you can write something like that.
Thank you.
So,
I just write a bunch of stuff and hope it helps my brain. And then if it makes sense to other people, that's good too.
Yeah, and it certainly did, yes. So even when Matthew was in the hospice and we knew his death was imminent, nothing could have prepared me for when he took his last breath. And I remember that day so clearly. I wanted to be there for Matthew and not leave his side. But I wanted to be there for you too. And I just remember feeling so conflicted. It was such a tough day. Do you remember much about it?
Yeah, and it's weird because I didn't used to remember a lot about it. There was like, because it's been, is it 8 years now?
7 years. It was
7 years in October.
Yeah.
So I think for a good 3 or 4 years, I didn't remember the day at all. And like I'd blocked it from my head. Whereas now I can remember elements of it quite clearly. And like it's probably the worst, like not even probably, it was the worst day like of my life, you know?
Yeah.
And it was weird on the actual day because for so long building up to that day, I would call maybe in the afternoon or the evening, and I'd speak to Dad and be like, oh, hey, so how's Matt doing? And Dad would say like, oh, you know, it's any day now, they say, and all this. And I would so it would be that, and then that night would come, and I would always like keep I'm getting emotional thinking about this, but I would keep my phone on and I wouldn't be able to sleep because I'd be terrified that I was going to miss a phone call in the night and, wake up and be like, oh, he's passed away in the night. And then I'd wake up the next day and obviously not had a phone call. So I was sort of, every day it was like, well, maybe it'll be today. And I'd had that for like it was like a week or maybe 2 weeks that happened. That had almost weirdly become normal. I wasn't so it was like, I was prepared for it, but I was also, it could have been tomorrow. Like, oh, today's going to be his last day, but it could have been the next day. And so you're constantly having to prepare yourself for this is the last day.
Yeah.
And I think we did know that it was going to be that day, but it was hard to sort of put yourself into that, like, this is definitely going to be the last day. And actually, my partner said something really interesting, which I'm like years later, which I think looking back on it was true, was that, how I was saying before about how I didn't really, I in my head, I'd expected him to get better.
Yeah.
I think that obviously there's those stages of grief. So there's like denial, that's one of those stages of grief.
Yeah.
I think I was in denial up until he died. So I remember there was sort of in my head a way that I expected things to go. Like because I even when he went into the hospice, I was like, some people go into the hospice for like a visit. They go in and they come out again, and it's very rare that happens. But sometimes that happens where it's just that they're going in for a little bit just to have some palliative care while they're just really, really poorly, and they could die, but they're going to be fine.
Yeah.
So I was convinced that was going to happen, and then it didn't, and I think immediately just went into shock. And I remember I was sitting outside when it actually happened, when he actually passed away, because I think they wanted to shave him or something. They wanted to clean him, give him, like, have a shave. So me and my partner were sitting outside, and then there was all this sort of commotion happening, and people were sort of rushing into his room, and then there was a couple of nurses that didn't look like they knew what they were doing. They were sort of, not to have any, they were obviously really good, but it was like there was a moment of like, something's happened.
Yeah.
What shall I do? That sort of feeling. And I just knew it's happened. Like, he's gone. That it was just like a
intuitively.
It was like something's happened.
Yeah.
It's something to do with Matt. It's happened. And I remember going to the door of his hospice room, and Dad coming out and being like, he's gone. And I went in, and I think it had just happened. He'd just gone, and you and his partner were really like just in tears, and he was sort of in a particular position, and he looked very, very much empty. I think is the word that I remember thinking, and all I remember thinking was like, I didn't want to see him like this, and that was when it was like shock.
Yeah.
Immediately like, what the hell has just happened?
Yeah.
Like, all of the denial had just sort of like punched me in the face, because like, oh, you wake up and it's like, crap, like this isn't denial, this isn't, he's not going to get better,
Yeah.
And so I sort of went out of the room and went into the little chapel in the hospice and just had a breakdown.
Yeah.
There's no other way to describe it. I just remember crying, and my partner was there and sort of holding me, and like, what do you say? This is something that you knew was coming, but at the same time, it's like, it's still a shock. And then I remember you coming out to see if I was okay, and you obviously wanted to stay with me and stay with Matt, and you wanted to go back to Matt, and it was like, my partner's here, they're fine. I'll be okay. But it was just, it was just a roller coaster, because I was suddenly like snapped into this reality that, oh, okay, everything that everyone's been saying for ages, like that Matt's terminally ill and Matt's not going to get better, like, I had to face the fact that, I'd been in denial this whole time.
Yeah.
And it's weird, because I think, and I haven't really spoken about this before, because I feel kind of, it's weirdly guilty to talk about, but I think it was adrenaline, because I remember we had to walk home from the hospice, and we didn't live very far away at the time. We lived around the corner from it. And as I was walking, I sort of, like, there was a point where I was laughing because I think it was shock because I was like, we were walking and I can't remember what was funny for the life of me, but I just started laughing about something. And I felt so guilty about that for such a long time because I was like, why am I laughing? My brother's just died like half an hour ago, you know, why am I laughing? But it was just shock. And, you know, so yeah. And again, I feel guilty about this, but you know, we were saying before about my phone and I was always having my phone on me.
Yeah.
I turned my phone off that night and slept like a baby. And I feel guilty about that as well because again, it's like, you know, I've just lost someone who I really care about. But I think it was a combination of I don't have to have my phone on anymore because there's no one there's no reason to have to be called in the middle of the night. And also the tremendous exhaustion of that day of being in so much like, you know, adrenaline and all the emotions that have gone through that day. I just slept. I got home and just slept. And I think I slept for most of the next day as well. Like I was just out of it.
Do you know, it's really interesting, isn't it, how that experience can hit you? Because even though you know it's coming, you can't prepare yourself for it. No. It's impossible. And I remember sleeping really well that night.
Yeah.
And waking up on the Saturday morning thinking, oh my God, that's the best night's sleep I've had for weeks. How could my son only died yesterday afternoon. How could I sleep?
Yeah.
You know, don't people have to have sleeping tablets to do this? But I think what came with it was some sort of relief.
Yeah.
Which is hard to say.
It is really hard to say because you feel guilty. It's like you shouldn't feel relieved that someone's died.
Yeah.
But it was a combination.
It wasn't a relief that he died. I know what you mean.
No,
but
I know,
why am I feeling this relief? Surely I shouldn't feel this. But it's a whole mix in there of emotions. And it's all normal, isn't it?
It's 100% normal.
It's absolutely 100% normal to feel what you're feeling.
And I think this podcast is a really good thing as well because we don't talk about this part of grief.
No.
The relief that you feel after a long, someone's passed away from a long illness.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be shameful to talk about it. It's not like we're happy that he died. That's beyond true. Beyond true? Is that the way? Is that how to say opposite of truth? It sounded wrong. Yeah. But it's just this feeling of you don't have to, because there's so much anxiety every day. You're constantly living in this sort of is it going to be now? I would
not knowing.
I have my phone glued to me 24/7. I could not be no. I just leave my phone in the other room and I'm fine without it. I could go for hours. I know you don't believe me on that, but I could go for hours without having my phone on me. Whereas before it would be glued to my hip. Whereas now, it's that anxiety of something.
Yeah.
We're going to hear bad news at some point, and I have to be prepared for it. And now it's we don't have that to worry about now. So it's hard to.
But it is whatever you're feeling at that moment is normal. Exactly. But I think, I've spoken about anticipatory grief before. We certainly experienced that, didn't we? Because when you see somebody fading through, a terminal diagnosis and they get weaker, you're grieving for that person as they disappear. So the grief doesn't just start when that person dies. It started weeks or even months before that person died. But even though, nothing can prepare you, can it? It was just so traumatic.
It was,
upsetting. So, grief is not a mental illness, but it can certainly turn into one. And Matthew's decline and death really affected your mental health, didn't it?
Yeah, I think that's normal.
Yeah. I know as parents, obviously, we were really concerned about you and you tried your best to protect us from worrying. But parents have superpowers and we pick up on these things. So what would you say to anyone who is worried about their mental health after the death of a loved one?
Do you mean someone worried about somebody else's mental health after the death of a loved one? Or?
About their own mental health.
Oh, okay, yeah. So
from your experience.
I think I've struggled with mental health for a long time, even before Matt, but obviously that sort of added onto it, I guess. Like
Yeah.
it became like a big part of it. I've you know, I'm quite open about the fact that I struggle with anxiety and so on, but we have such a stigma in society about mental health, and you know, people feel like they can't talk about it, and people judge people who are mentally ill, and it's massively unfair. And so I think a lot of people who have mental health issues, regardless of what's caused them, whether if it's grief or trauma or just, you know, chemical imbalances in a lot of cases, you know, there's nothing wrong with you. That's something that's really important to say. There's nothing wrong with you if you're experiencing mental health issues. You know, you're allowed to be sad.
Yeah.
You're like, that's normal sometimes. Like a lot of the time it's normal, you know. We live in a world that's quite sad a lot of the time. There's a lot of sad things that happen. And so, you know, we judge people a lot for not being happy-go-lucky all the time and not being switched on all the time. But, you know, we're allowed, when, like, it's a normal human emotion to feel sad when someone dies. It's normal to feel angry when someone dies. And I think just giving yourself permission to feel those things is so important. A lot of people don't let themselves feel them, and they just bottle them up, and, you know, they force themselves to just go through the motions and just carry on. And that's just going to exacerbate it and just make it worse. And it's going to make it even harder to deal with. I
agree. Some people find it easier perhaps to push it down, suppress it. I'm not going to deal with that now.
Yeah.
And they go through life and not experiencing those emotions.
Yeah.
And things will come along and trigger them. And, you know, there is a theory that if we don't process our emotions, they can turn into an ache, a pain, an illness, or a disease.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's,
so it's so important that we feel these emotions, we acknowledge these emotions, and give ourselves space to process them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, you know, any mental health is all about communicating.
100%, yeah. And it's so hard to do when you're actually in that feeling, but just expressing it, just saying, this is how I'm feeling, and I don't feel good. It's hard because of the stigma in society, I honestly think. Like, I think that if it wasn't so frowned upon for people not to feel like they, I don't know, like even little things like, oh, I can't, you know, make a healthy meal this week because I'm just not feeling it. I can't tidy my house because I'm not, like, I can't feel up to it. Like, people frown upon people for that. And, you know, there's nothing, like, if you have a messy house for a bit, like, it's fine. No one's, like, the world isn't going to end. You know, but people, like, in society, we judge people for that. And I think, it's just, I think...
Do you not think we're getting better at talking about mental health now? Things are improving.
Yeah, in some ways. I think things are improving in the conversations that we have about it.
Yeah.
For some mental health issues. There are so many mental health issues that aren't, like, fashionable, and I'm saying that in quotation marks. Like, depression and anxiety, I don't say they're fashionable. That's not, like, I'm not trying to imply that they're cool mental health issues to have, but there are, like, whenever we talk about mental health, those are the only two I think that really get a lot of attention.
Okay.
When there's a lot of mental health problems out there that are really stigmatized, that I think the people in those communities, I think we're going on a bit of a tangent about mental health, but, you know.
Well, it's important, isn't it, to have these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and another thing that doesn't really get talked about is sibling death.
Oh, 100%. You know? And that's kind of, you know, why I wanted to talk about stuff, you know.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted you to be on the podcast, because I just think this is one area of grief that we just don't tend to tell people that my brother, my sister died. It's almost, it's interesting, isn't it? It's common for everyone in the family to walk around on eggshells. Everyone's trying to control their emotions so they don't upset each other. So it's often easier to talk to a counsellor or a therapist. In fact, you did have counselling for a while, didn't you? How did you find it?
I think counselling is really, really important for anyone to go through, even if you don't think that you need it. And especially if you struggle with mental health issues.
Yeah.
And especially for grief, because it's such a massive thing, a massive trauma. I won't say it's easy. It wasn't easy for me. It's not a fun procedure. It's not a procedure. That sounds surgical. It's not a fun experience. For me, I found it extremely beneficial, extremely healing. Because I think a lot of people don't realise about counselling is that it gives you that neutral place to say anything that you want, and even things that you don't really agree with, that you just kind of want to experiment like the thought with, like you just kind of want to be like, I feel a bit like this, and this might not be the true way I feel, but if I say it out loud, then I can process whether or not it makes sense to me. And so it gives you that space just to sort of completely be whatever.
Yeah.
And then you get challenged on it and you say, is that how you really want to think? Is that like, how true is that? And that can be like, for me, it was a lot to do with my self-image and sort of self-confidence and stuff, like, you know, saying things like limiting beliefs I had about myself, essentially, and guilt that I had, and being challenged on that and being like, oh, maybe actually I don't think that way, actually, or maybe I don't want to feel that way, actually. So I really found it beneficial.
Well, it's so much better, isn't it, easier to talk to a stranger than it is to your own family.
Yeah,
especially
absolutely.
around when
Especially
your
mum
family.
on a podcast.
Well, I know, but no, we do have some great conversations,
no, I do. Yeah,
don't we? And,
yeah, I think it's really important to talk to people that you love as well.
Yeah.
I just think therapy it gives you that place to just
absolutely
say whatever and not get judged for it, because it doesn't have any long, like, if I said some things to you that I said in therapy, you'd be like, are you all right? Like, do you need to go and see like a doctor?
Don't tell me, because I'll just have something else to worry about. So, did your friends know what to say or do after Matthew died? Or
Nobody
did they
knew
feel
what to say.
awkward around you in the early days?
I don't know about awkward, because me and my friends are all a bunch of awkward people anyway.
That's true.
So awkwardness is kind of part of the course for us, but no one knew what to say. Going back to, you know, we were saying about sibling death, like that was a big thing that I think people didn't know what to say, because a lot of people have experienced death. Like, I think all of us are going to experience death at some point in our lives, you know, like if we live long enough, like, you know, we're going to lose people. But most people lose grandparents first, then parents, and then siblings later down the line.
Yeah.
To lose your brother even before your grandparents die, you know, it's extremely isolating, because, you know, people will say like, oh, you know, and no grief is the same. So like, I can't compare losing Matt to losing, you know, a grandparent or somebody else was really close to. But like, some people would say like, oh, you know, I know how you feel because I lost my gran to cancer, or I lost my friend to cancer. It's like, it's not the same. Like, you can't, it's not comparable in the same way that me saying, you know, I lost my brother isn't comparable to them losing a grandparent or whatever. But we don't talk about death enough, and sibling death is just like so rare. Because, you know, like, to be morbid, you prepare yourselves for the deaths of the people, like the people who are older than you in your life, you know? You know that eventually your parents are going to pass away. You know eventually your grandparents are going to pass away, and your older family members, like, it's like, you know, they're older than you. You're supposed to pass away before
it's a natural order of things,
you know,
isn't it?
It's kind of a morbid thing to say, but it's like, it's sort of, it's the natural order of things, like you said. So, like, and, you know, like, sort of passing thoughts, you'd be like, oh, well, when mum and dad finally go, you know, Matt will be around to, like, help and keep their memories alive, and we can talk about stuff and, like, roll our eyes at them a little bit because sometimes they're embarrassing things.
What still?
And, like, you know, I see family members, like, I've got lots of cousins, as you know. And, you know, I see them having banters with each other, with their siblings. And this was especially, like, the bigger, it really hit me. I think it was the first Christmas after Matt died. Because we all went to Manchester, a bunch of us went to Manchester, a bunch of my cousins. And, you know, like some of them, the brothers and sisters would, like, bicker. And then one of my aunts would say something, and then their kids would, like, look at each other and, like, roll their eyes.
Yeah.
And it was, like, little things like that I really miss.
Yeah.
Like, you know, Matt used to tease Dad a lot.
Yeah.
And I just kind of miss the sort of, like, little glances we'd have where it would be like, this sounds like all we'd hit the mickey out of you. But all, like, things like, oh, you know, like, oh, what are you going to get Dad for his birthday? What are you going to get Mum for her birthday? Like, oh, well, this is what I was thinking. What about you? And,
Yeah.
like, we'd have those little, you know, moments. And, yeah, like, I don't know, it's just, it's sad, obviously. But now it's like, I don't know, it just feels very isolating because it's like, am I an only child now? And
Yeah.
people will ask me, like, oh, you know, it's casual conversation, do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yeah.
I'm like,
yeah.
how do I answer that without suddenly making this, like, really oversharing? Like, I used to,
Yeah.
but he's gone now. And then it's like, oh, what do people say? People have to go step around. It's like, oh, I'm really sorry. Like, wish I hadn't bloody asked you. You know? And then you say it's cancer, and that's a whole other thing because cancer's like, oh my gosh, that's really awful. I really wish I hadn't asked now.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like, I think people know what to say if it's your parents. Like, if someone says, like, oh, you know, I've lost my dad or whatever. Like, you know, I've got a friend whose dad passed away. Like, you know what to say. Like, oh, it's like, oh, you know, oh,
Yeah.
there's all that. Like, I don't know, not know what to say, but, like, it's, you know, it's expected it's at some point in your life your parents are going to pass away.
Yeah, it's a different dynamic, isn't
It's
it? With
very
a sibling?
different. Yeah, it's
Yeah. So apart from counselling, Piper, what other things helped you navigate your grief journey?
For me, it was like writing and creating stuff.
Yeah.
So, like, I wrote that letter. I wrote a few things. I wrote a letter to Matt as well. I think it was also in that book, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
And just, like, letting myself, like, sit in it.
Yeah.
Kind of leaning into it a little bit. And this is, I
Yeah.
think, this is kind of going back to therapy a little bit, was you know, I really learned how to sit in that discomfort rather than, like, shy away from it. Or not feel it, like, just sort of sit in that discomfort. And I think I talk to myself a lot in my head, you know?
Yeah.
And I'll, I guess, like, and yeah, I guess time as well. And there's that really, I don't know if you've seen it, there's a really good little thing I found on the internet where it talks about grief being like a ball. And when it first happens, it's this really big ball that's sort of, like, impounding your entire life. And everyone assumes what you have to do with grief is to squash that ball and make it smaller so that you can, like, carry on with your life or whatever, which I think is a horrible thing to say because I'll get onto that in a second, I guess. But yeah, I don't think you should compress that ball. I think you should keep that ball where it is, and it's horrible and uncomfortable and it feels awful. But then, rather than shrink the ball down and try and compress those thoughts and press those emotions away, you have to, like, let yourself grow around the ball.
Absolutely.
So this isn't a video, so I can't explain it with my hands, but, you know, so, you know, you grow around it, your life gets bigger and the ball stays the same size, but you get bigger and the ball's still there and it hurts and it, you know, it's upsetting a lot of the time. And there are still times where, like, I'll just, you know, it's out of the blue, I'll suddenly, without any context, just suddenly feel really, really sad.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's so important just to let yourself feel sad. Like,
Absolutely.
you know, if you want to, you know, if you need to sort of take 5 minutes and have a bit of a cry, that should be fine to do. And I just go and do it, you know.
Yeah, well, and it's healthy to do that.
It really is.
Don't, you know, stop yourself from doing that. And I love that model about the ball.
Yeah.
I've seen it in a picture example where the ball is in a jar and
Yeah.
the ball fills the jar up.
I think we've seen the same thing. I'll just explain it badly.
No, I've seen a few different varieties of the how it's been illustrated. And then you get a bigger jar and a bigger jar. So the ball stays the same, but you just grow around it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's how I feel is a healthy way to process the grief. You're not squashing it. You're not pushing it down. You're not putting it in a little box.
Yeah.
You're allowing it to be there. You're allowing yourself to feel it, to process it, and you just grow around it.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm currently halfway through a book by Catherine Mannix called With the End in Mind, and it's all about death and dying, and I'm finding it weirdly comforting. But can you recommend any books, films, podcasts, or support groups for other people?
So I'm not actually in any support groups for grief. I did read a really good book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers. That was gifted to me actually. Shortly after Matt passed away, and it's a really beautiful. It's quite dark. But a really beautiful book. I'm not like very good at religion and spirituality things. I'm very I have a dark sense of humor, and I like reading dark stuff, and that helps my brain process things. But yeah, the Grief was the Thing with Feathers was very good, and a very, very dark but healthy looking grief. Like it's like how I said in therapy, sitting with those dark bad emotions. It sort of pushes you to do that and lets you sit with it. It's
quite a well-known book.
Oh, is it?
I'll put that in the show notes so people can check it
I
out.
hope I've described it well, because it's been a while since I read it.
Yeah. So I know you don't have a faith or a religion, but do you believe that there is something? Because we've had many philosophical chats over the years about death, but maybe you'd like to share your thoughts about what you think about the afterlife.
Yeah, so I have a really complicated relationship with faith as a concept. Like, I'm not a religious person. I have no problem with people who are religious, but for me, it's never really like fit, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I do. So I've always been a very skeptical person, but I'm sort of I've always described myself as a bad atheist because I believe in science, but I also have a very clear idea. It's almost like I'm believing it for comfort. It's like I'm allowing myself to believe these things because it makes me feel better.
Yeah.
And like, people will probably listen to that and be like, well, that just, they're being a bit silly now, because like, obviously that those things exist and you're just pretending. But no, I don't really care what, like, how it, like, what actually is true in that sense, because it helps me feel better.
Yeah.
And that idea is that I don't believe in heaven or anything like that. I don't believe in an afterlife as like that specific thing. I guess I just believe in, like, all of our souls are made of like little grains of sand, and when you die, you go back into that little grain of sand mode. I'm explaining this really badly.
Okay.
And all of the little grains of sand are mixed around in the world with all the other bits of grains of sand.
Yeah.
And that is what happens when we die. Like, I have this idea that our souls are just kind of absorbed into everything else. Yeah. And so Matt's soul and like Grandma's soul and, next door neighbour who lives down the street that I've never met soul, you know, they're all like mushed into this big sort of spiritual soup.
Yeah.
And, I'll be walking through my day, and sometimes I'll feel like I may be. This is a really terrible analogy. This is like this is terrible. Like soul soup. This sounds awful. But I'll feel like I'll be walking through the world, and I'll like brush past some like of Matthew's soul soup.
Okay.
This makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And it's like, I feel a little bit like, I feel close to Matthew. That felt really nice.
Yeah.
And especially when I'm doing things like playing music or drawing or something, that's usually when like I feel like he's around. There was a time, especially when I was making a video I think it was the first anniversary after he passed away. I made a little video to put on Facebook to sort of celebrate him. And as I was editing it, I felt like he was telling me which photos to put on.
Oh, wow.
And I felt like, because it's one of my favourite photos of him is when he was maybe about 8 or 9 years old, and he's like hanging backwards off this like monkey bar or something. And he's like upside down, got a great big massive grin on his face. And he was like, yeah, put that one in my head.
Oh, how lovely.
And so it felt like we made that video together.
Yes, yeah. So it's an interesting view that you've got, and I totally get it. So do you believe our loved ones can give us signs?
Yes and no. I think that it's one of those things where I'm like, I kind of choose to believe they can, but I don't believe they can. I don't know. This sounds very contradictory. But like, I will interpret things I see as signs.
Yeah.
And that gives me comfort. And so I will say, well, that was Matthew.
And that's all that matters if you're getting comfort
Exactly.
from it.
Like, I think that whatever we do to find comfort in grief is fine. And that's
absolutely.
Like, it doesn't matter if that's religion, if that's spiritual soup, apparently, or if that, something like
I think you've just started a new religion.
I have, haven't I? I need to write a book about spiritual soup. It's got a good name as well, spiritual soup.
It's a good name.
But
Give me some ideas.
And there are people that I know who don't believe anything at all, and they're fully like, when you die, it's like an off switch, and consciousness stops. And I kind of like get that. Like I think there's a little part of my brain that does believe that, but it doesn't make me feel good to think that.
Yeah.
But that's fine if that's how they think things are going to be, and they feel comfort from that, and that's there's nothing wrong with any of these viewpoints. It's
absolutely so it's whatever gives you comfort.
Exactly. Because grief is such a horrible thing to experience. Like, I think that whatever we can do to get comfort from it we should take comfort in it.
Absolutely. So for people who have just lost a loved one, or perhaps for others who maybe have been stuck in grief for years, what words of wisdom could you share to maybe help them loosen their grief in some way? I
think I would say just breathe it in. And does that make sense?
I like that.
Like, don't try and, like, in the throes of it, like in the very first few days, everything is just too much. Everything is just so overwhelming. And it's like, you can't do anything. And allow yourself to not do anything. Give yourself that space if you have the capacity to even think about that, Yeah. Like, give yourself that space to just be in shock, because it's a shock. It's a shock. It's a traumatic experience. And breathe it in. Like, just don't try and, I keep saying that, but like, what I mean is, like, just let it be in you. Like, just let yourself feel that, because it is not going to go away.
Yeah.
It's a horrible thing to say, but like, it's I think grief is one of the worst experiences that, you can have. When I was younger, I was like, I used to think the worst thing that could ever happen to me was my brother passing away, and then that bloody happened.
Yeah.
And it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But yeah, like, grief is I was going to say something else then, but I can't remember what it was going to be. But yeah, it's the worst thing you can experience. And I think the reason why it is so horrible is because grief can't happen unless you love somebody in some capacity. If I think maybe it was you who said it to me, or somebody was talking to me about grief is like love.
Yeah.
And unless you experience love, you can't understand it. In the same way, unless you experience grief, you can't understand it. And you can't escape it. You can't, you can try and push it down and try and make it smaller, or you can try and, throw it away and distract yourself and try and do something else, but it is there and it is going to hit you in the face. So regardless of whether it's happened yesterday or 10 years ago, just
Just allow it to be there.
Let it to hit you in the face.
Yeah, you can't.
You know.
It can't be avoided. Allow it to be there.
Yeah.
And just know that it won't always feel like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, that's great advice.
In some ways, it can be beautiful. You know, like we were talking about, you know, seeing signs and things.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, if you allow yourself to sort of, you know, let it punch you in the face, there are also times where it can almost embrace you and you know, it can sort of be felt, I don't know, sometimes I felt like enveloped by this like really strong feeling of love because I feel close to Matt and it's like, oh, this is really nice.
Yeah.
And really beautiful. And I don't know, but I feel like I wouldn't have had that experience if I hadn't fully sort of leaned into it.
Absolutely.
You know?
So where are you in your grief journey now?
I don't really know.
Okay.
What's a grief journey? I don't know how to answer that question. I don't think it's a journey that ever has an end. And I know people who have died since Matt, who I was close to. I've a couple of friends of mine have passed away in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and their deaths all kind of feel not the same, but like that it feels connected. They all feel like they're part of the whole scope of grief, and I wasn't as close as I was to them as I was to Matt, but like. Whenever I know somebody who dies, it almost feels like they're in the spiritual soup that I keep apparently going back to. Yeah. So it all feels connected. And so I feel like, I don't feel like grief has a journey necessarily to me that's ending. I feel like it's just a constant experience. And I've just got better at handling that experience.
Yeah, yeah.
I feel like I'm just better equipped at talking about it.
Yeah.
And... it used to be that when I felt it, it felt like it was never going to go away. And when I felt really bad, like the really bad waves of grief, it just sort of felt trapped. And I felt like this isn't ever going to get better. I'm never going to get better from this. It's going to be panic attacks and crying and meltdowns every 5 minutes. And now it's like when I do feel that, it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to step away for a minute.
Yeah.
Let myself feel it. It's going to be horrible for 5 minutes, half an hour, however long. And then I'm going to pick myself up and I'm going to say, oh, okay. That was that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then carry on. Yeah. So, I don't know if it ever really goes away. It's not really, it doesn't have an ending to me. It's just...
No, it's very true. You know, some losses last a lifetime.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know you've had a beautiful tattoo done to remember Matthew, but what other things do you do to keep his memory alive? Do you have any rituals or anything to remember him by?
Yeah, I mean, I think about him pretty much all the time. And every year on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death, I have a little candle. And we'll spend maybe like 20 minutes. We'll get the candle out, turn off the lights in the house, make sure the cats aren't going to set fire or anything, book to the cats, and then just sit, and me and my partner will just sort of hold the candle together, and I'll just think about Matt, and I'll sort of, say hi, how are you doing? And have that moment of, I guess in some ways you could call it a prayer, in a way, like a sort of, I hope you're doing well, and wherever you are.
I think that's beautiful, and we always talk about him, don't we?
Yeah, we talk about it all the
time. Which is because he's still part of our lives, isn't he?
Exactly, 100%.
So if you could give Matthew a message now, what would you say?
That's a hard question. But I love him. I think that's the biggest thing is, hey Matt, I love you.
You're going to get me going now. Just saying.
I think there are parts of me that doesn't feel like anything needs to be said, because in my version of not in events, but in my version of spirituality, it's almost like when somebody dies, they know everything in the universe. They know who you are exactly, and they know And that's kind of something, sorry, this is kind of a tangent from the question, but this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, like, because obviously going back to the fact that I changed my name and the person I've become after Matt's died, I feel much more confident in myself. I'm happier. I've got a job that I really love. And these are all things I just didn't have before Matt passed away. And there's part of me that feels really sad that he doesn't get to see that. He doesn't get to see me being happy.
Yeah.
Because I know that he worried about me a lot with that sort of thing. But I feel like he just knows. He just knows that I'm okay.
Yeah.
And so there's a part of me that feels like I don't need to say anything because he knows. But at the same time, it's nice to say.
Yeah.
And so I think, saying that I love him, that I miss him a lot, and that I just hope that whatever realm of existence he is in now, he can still look back at this occasionally and like wave and be like, hey guys.
Yeah, yeah.
Chuck a football at someone now and then. So yeah.
Oh, I think that's beautiful. And I think that's a beautiful way to end our podcast on today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the death of a sibling can be very difficult to process. Our siblings often share our family history and formative years, and their death can make us feel unsure about our place in the world. We're supposed to grow old with them and share a special bond. But when a brother or sister dies, it's common for people to focus their support on the parents, the partner, or the children of the person who died. Siblings, whether adults or children, can sometimes be left out and made to feel like their grief doesn't matter. And this feeling is called disenfranchised grief. While we live in a culture that encourages us to move on, grieving the death of a sibling can take a lifetime. It's a very special loss. Piper will never be an auntie, and she has lost the only other person who knew and understood our family dynamic. Matthew will be very proud of his sister for sharing her story. Not only is it keeping his memory alive, it will help others who have gone through a similar journey. So thank you for being on my podcast, Piper.
Thank you.
I just love you so much.
Aww,
thank you.
I guess I love you too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of A Gift for Grief. Please feel free to share it with your friends and family, and let's encourage others to become more grief literate. If you're struggling with your grief or worried about your mental health, please do speak to your doctor. If you would like to join me on my social media groups, check out the show notes for all the links, and I look forward to connecting with you next time. The music on this podcast was written and recorded by Matthew Bates and can be found on his 2 albums, Fight Back and Kaleidoscope.